Good evening. Today's lecture is about removable partial denture components, and it's the second in the series. And today's components are direct and indirect retainers. Now, direct retainers uh, are the components of removable partial denture that is used to retain and prevent dislodgement of the prosthesis away from teeth and tissues. This can be a clasp assembly or precision attachment. Retention in general is a resistance, the inherent quality in the prosthesis which resists the force of gravity, the adhesiveness of food, and the forces associated with the opening of the jaws. It resists the movement of the denture in general away from teeth and tissues. Now, direct retention is the retention obtained in a removable partial denture by the use of clasps or attachments, which resist the removal from the abutment teeth, as opposed to indirect retention, which is obtained in removable partial dentures through the use of indirect retainers اللي رح نحكي عنهم at the end of this lecture. Now, the classification of direct retainers uh, they can be classified into extracoronal, and extracoronal direct retainers can be classified into extracoronal attachments like Dalbo, for example, and or retentive clasp assemblies, while intracoronal direct retainers are mainly precision attachments. They can be stud, they can be bar, and these are examples على intracoronal attachments where the attachment itself is within the contours of the teeth. The preparation to receive the attachment is within the preparation of the teeth. A stud attachment is actually within the root of the tooth, mainly for root treated teeth. This is an example for a stud attachment. You can see in the picture below a stud attachment. You actually prepare the tooth after it has been endodontically treated, and you place an intraradicular attachment in here. It's a stud, and the prosthesis has the clip on which it clips on top of the stud. This is stud attachment, and it's kind of intracoronal precision. Now, extracoronal direct retainers, the direct retainer, whether it is an attachment or a clasp assembly, is contained outside the contours of the teeth, the normal contours of the teeth. This is an example of an extracoronal precision attachment. It's called Dalbo. There are so many different types. I don't want to go through them right now. هتاخدوا عنهم بالfifth year. Now you fix extracoronal uh, um, attachment on the tooth outside the contours, and this is the male part, and the female part is within the prosthesis, and they clip precisely on each other, and that's how they provide retention. Now, direct retainers, our clasp assemblies, the other type of direct retainers of the extracoronal direct retainers is the clasp. And we say clasp assemblies, not just clasps, because they are actually there are different components for the clasp assemblies that should be within the clasp itself. The components are there. First of all, there should be a retentive arm, a reciprocal arm, whether it is an arm, plate, or a combination of mesial and distal minor connectors, rest, and minor connectors. There can be also shoulder to connect between the minor connector and the arms in suprabulge clasps, and body that connects the rest to the minor connectors. Now, each component of these is provided to provide fulfill certain requirement in the clasp assembly اللي رح نحكي عنها هلا. This is an example of a suprabulge or occlusally approaching a class that has all the components that we mentioned in the previous slide. Mainly there is an occlusal wrist here. There is a retentive arm that is composed of a retentive clasp arm and a retentive tip that goes in the undercut area under the survey line, and there is the shoulder that connects between the retentive arm and the body of the clasp assembly, and the body connects between the rest, the retentive reciprocal arms, and the minor connectors. The minor connector holds the clasp assembly in general and fulfills other function as well. And this is another shoulder that connects between the body of the clasp assembly with the reciprocal arm. So the reciprocal component here is a reciprocal arm. This is another view for the components. You can see that the part of the minor connector is actually guiding plate, contacting the guiding plane prepared on the tooth surface, and then there is the shoulder connecting between the minor connector and the occlusal wrist and the retentive and reciprocal arms. The retentive arm goes from the body of the clasp assembly, crossing the survey line, going inside the underneath the undercut. So the retentive tip is the only component of the clasp assembly that goes under the survey line, and the rest of the clasp assembly is actually rigid, and only the retentive tip is flexible. Now, the principle of clasp design, first of all, there should be a rest. The rest is designed to prevent tissue-ward movement of the clasp assembly. The retentive arm, and this is very important, the retentive arm of occlusally approaching clasp should not approach closer more than 1 millimeter to the gingival margin. Otherwise, it irritates the gingiva. So we provide an occlusal, not just an occlusal, a rest. A rest in the clasp assembly will prevent tissue-wards movement of the clasp assembly. It keeps it in its place, it provides retention, and also it prevents irritation to the gingiva from the retentive arm. Also, usually each retentive terminal should be opposed by a reciprocal component. Now, the reciprocal component is provided at the height of contour, and the retentive element should be below the height of contour or the survey line. Now نحن حكينا عن reciprocation إنه as the retentive tip goes below and above the survey line, it will exert force on the tooth to the other direction. Now, so that's why there should be a component that resists this movement on the other direction, on the opposite side of the retentive arm. So we provide a reciprocal component طبعا above the survey line. Now there should be balanced retention. Where there are clasps on opposite side of the arch, retentive arms are placed on opposing tooth surfaces. يعني if you place the retentive tip on the buccal side on one tooth, the other on the other side it should be provided on the buccal. If you place it on the lingual, it should be provided on the lingual side of the other side. All right, now you have to one of the basic principles of the design of partial denture is the simplicity. So you have to use the minimum amount of retention or the minimum number of direct retainers to provide retention to keep the denture in its place, but keeping the design simple. يعني مش شطارة إن نضل نحط clasps. It becomes over retentive. The patient cannot take it out and insert it easily. The seating of the framework will be very hard. and this opposes the principle of simplicity. Now, the functional requirements of the clasp. First functional requirement of the clasp is to provide retention, and this is provided by the retentive tip. The stability, it should be stable. There should be stabilizing components to prevent horizontal movement of the clasp assembly. And also it has to have support via the rest to prevent towards movement of the clasp assembly. It has to have reciprocal component to resist movement of the tooth to the other direction caused by the forces from the retentive tip, and it should encircle as much of the tooth structure as possible, and it should be passive during function. Now the retention. Again, a retention is the resistance to movement away from teeth or tissues. Now this is the most important function of the clasp, and this is provided by the retentive tip. Now there are so many factors affecting the retention provided by the clasp assembly. First, the depth of the undercut. The deeper the undercut, the more difficult the insertion and removal becomes, and thus the more retention provided. The depth of the undercut goes in three dimensions. Buckle-lingual width, this determines the clasp type of the alloy. This is the depth that we actually or width that we actually measure via the surveyor's gauge. Now, more flexible alloys for deeper, you use more flexible alloys for deeper undercuts. يعني 0.25 cobalt chromium is appropriate. If it is deeper than that, then if it is 0.5 or 0.75, you use gold or wrought wires. You cannot use the rigid cobalt chromium for undercuts deeper than 0.25. Occlusogingival height determines the length of the clasp and thus its flexibility. The longer the clasp, then it becomes more flexible and less retention provided. Mesodistal depth is also determines the length of the retentive tip, which طبعا the longer the retentive tip, the less retention it provides. Now, cross-sectional form of the clasp. There are two types or two forms of the cross-section for the clasp. They can be round. Round clasps are flexible in all directions, while if it is half round, it is flexible only in one direction. So round clasps, for example, are preferred for distal extensions because we need stress breaking effect. رح تاخدوا عنه later. Now the approach of the clasp. في عنا gingival approaching clasps وفي عنا occlusally approaching clasps رح نحكي عنهم هلا. Generally, if all factors are the same, gingivally approaching clasps provide better retention than occlusally approaching clasps. Cross-sectional dimension of the clasp, أكيد the thicker the clasp, the more retention it provides because it is less flexible. Taper of the clasp, uniformly tapered clasps are more flexible and provide less retention than non-tapered clasps. Curvature of the clasps, a clasp that is curved in more than one plane has reduced flexibility and it provides more retention. Now, this is regarding the retention provided by the clasps. Stability for the clasp assembly is the quality of the denture to be firm, steady, or constant to resist displacement by horizontal forces. Now, stability for the prosthesis in general and the clasp assembly to stay or to resist horizontal forces is provided by the reciprocal element, the shoulder of an occlusally approaching clasp, and any vertically oriented part of the minor connectors. Support, حكينا we need rest in the clasp assembly to resist the movement of the denture in more gingival direction. And this is provided by the rest part of the clasp assembly mainly, but also it can be provided by the shoulder, and the minor connector might contribute to support to a much lesser extent. So it's mainly provided by the rest. Reciprocation, the means by which one part of the prosthesis is made to counter the effect created by another part. Now, reciprocation is needed for the clasp assembly to prevent horizontal movement, to prevent that is actually caused by the tip of by the retentive tip, as it goes below and above the survey line. Now, ideally, it should be provided opposite to the retentive tip. Now, if the reciprocating clasp is used, it should be placed at the gingival end of the guiding surface on the clasp tooth, while if it is a plate, reciprocation can be obtained by a guiding plate on the connector. Now, again, the reciprocal element can be a reciprocal arm, can be a reciprocal plate, it can be a combination of minor connectors and guiding planes. Whatever it is, the more ideal is to be placed opposite to the retentive tip. Now, on the other side of the retentive tip, it's most effective at exactly opposite the point, exactly opposite to the retentive tip. Now, if it's a reciprocal arm, akid, we need to prepare guiding plane on the opposite side to have the reciprocal arm touching the tooth at the right time during insertion and removal. Or it can be a plate, for example. This slide shows how the reciprocal component is most effective in the area exactly opposite to the retentive tip, but generally, because the clasp assembly should encircle as much as possible from the tooth structure, the reciprocal component covers usually the whole surface, not just a point. Again, in this slide, it shows how the reciprocal arm is touching the gingival end of the guiding surface during insertion and removal, and while on the last one there is a guiding plate extended from the major connector is actually the reciprocal component. Whatever the component is, it's supposed to be there to provide reciprocation. Now, encirclement, the clasp must encircle more than 180 degrees of the abutment tooth. All right, the more the better. It can be continuous encirclement, like in circumferential clasps, or it can be broken contact, like in infrabulge clasps. It has three broad contacts on the tooth surface. The sum of them should be more than 180 degrees. This property prevents movement of the tooth away from the clasp assembly. It has to encircle as much as possible علشان يضل التooth within the clasp assembly. All right, now passivity is also a very important requirement of the clasp. It's the quality or condition of inactivity or rest assumed by the teeth tissues and denture when RPD is fully seated. It should not exert any force on the tooth or tissues, on the tooth while it is seated in its place. All right, now incomplete seating of the prosthesis results in the retentive tip of the clasp applying harmful forces on the teeth. This is very common, so that's why when completely seated, it should exert no force, because if it is incompletely seated, then it will be exerting continuous forces on the teeth. Then this is why you have to make sure that the fit of the prosthesis is perfect. Now, again, types of the clasps, they can be classified into occlusally approaching clasps, or supra-bulge clasps. They approach the undercut from an occlusal direction. أو gingivally approaching clasps اللي هم بنسميهم برضو infrabulge clasps. They approach the undercut from gingival or infrabulge direction. These are the two major categories. رح نحكي عن different types of clasps within both categories. Now, occlusally approaching clasps, this is one example of the circumferential clasp. حكيت عن الكومبوننتس تبعتهم قبل شوي. Uh, um, Basically, these are the components of the most commonly used occlusally approaching clasp, which is circumferential clasp. Now, the advantages of this kind of clasps. أول شيء, it is the easiest clasp to make and repair. It causes less food retention, and it is best to be applied in tooth-supported RPDs, basically in molars and molars. Premolars, هلا بنحكي, it is not recommended. It drives excellent support, bracing or reciprocation and retention. While the disadvantages, أول شيء, it covers large tooth surface area because it encircles more than 180 degrees of the tooth structure, and it is difficult to adjust with pliers. Very commonly it breaks while you try to adjust it, and it should never be used to engage the mesobuccal undercut in distal extension RPDs because it is too rigid. Now, again, it is recommended on molars, occlusally approaching clasps, because, again, the retentive arm to be tapered and to have the retentive tip flexible, you have to have around 15 millimeters mesodistally, and this can be provided in a molar لأنه كبير, while in premolars they are short. So if you want to use a clasp on premolars, it is recommended to use infrabulge or gingivally approaching, or if you have to use occlusally approaching, you have to have different material other than cobalt chromium, more flexible material like gold or wrought wire. Now, there is the simple circlet clasp. هدول different types of occlusally approaching clasps. Not all of them are commonly used. Simple circlet is the most commonly used. Reverse circlet, multiple circlet, embragure, ring clasp, fishhook or hairpin or reverse action, onlay clasp, combination clasp, half and half, and back action clasp. Now, this is what I was talking about. Now, the retentive tip of a closely approaching clasp should be at least 15 millimeters in length and engages no more than 0.25 if made in cobalt chromium. And this just should be restricted to molars. Now, a retentive clasp engaging 0.5 millimeter undercut, a 0.5 or 0.75, it should not be made in cobalt chromium. So if you use cobalt chromium occlusally approaching on molars, and if you have an undercut of 0.25, if you have deeper undercut or if you have smaller tooth, you use wrought wire and or a different kind of clasp for premolars, for example. Now, if the undercut on the tooth is less than 0.25, this is insufficient to provide amount of retention needed. You should build up bulge in composite resin added on the tooth surface to create at least the amount of undercut needed. This is a simple circlet clasp, and it's basically used for two supported RPDs, again on molars mainly. It goes from the edentulous space, and then there is the rest, and then it goes to the other side above the survey line, and then the retentive tip goes on to the other direction of the tooth to the other side of the tooth from the edentulous space. And again, reciprocal arm on the other side. This is the most commonly used. Now, scenario A, you can use simple circuit class because the deeper undercut is actually on the other side from the edentulous space. So it goes from the other side and under the survey line to the undercut. While in B, if you use a simple circlet, it's not recommended because it's very close to the gingiva, and we said the retentive tip cannot be closer to the gingiva than 1 millimeter. In C, this is a fish hook or reverse action class where you use it where the retentive undercut is actually on the same side of the edentulous space. So you either use the reverse circlet or you use this type. So basically you have to see where the undercut is. If it is on the other side from the edentulous space, you use simple circlet. If it is not, then you have to think of other options. Reverse circlet, this is used when you have the undercut closer to the edentulous space. Then you go to the other side of the tooth from the edentulous saddle، يعني هون مثلا mesially مش distally، and it goes from the mesial to the distal, and the retentive tip engages the distal undercut. Now, basically in distal extensions and especially on premolars, infrabulge or gingivally approaching clasps are recommended. Now, if there is a contraindication, then you think of other options. هون مثلا استعملنا reverse circlet or reverse approach clasp, but the ideal is to use I-bar. أو يعني yes, gingivally approaching clasps. Multiple circlet clasp, this is used when the principal abutment has poor periodontal support, so it engages multiple teeth. Embrager clasp or double acres, this is used on the dentate side. طبعا of course you by now you know that the partial denture should extend on the other side, even if it is if the edentulous space is on one side, it should extend to the other side of the jaw to provide cross arch stabilization. Now, frequently the other side, if it is مثلا simple class 3 or يعني there are no missing teeth on the other side, then you will have to use clasps on the other side where there are teeth. So you use embrager clasp or double acres clasp. This has two rests two rests or two occlusal rests on two adjacent teeth, and it has two retentive arms and reciprocal arms on both sides of the teeth. Now, to accommodate this and to have it within the contours of the teeth, after you prepare the rest seats for the rests, you have to lower the margins of the tooth to create space for the embragers to create space for the retentive and reciprocal arms uh, uh, um, to go on the buccal and labial surfaces. This is an example where we have simple class 3 and has no modifications, and you have to extend it on the other side for cross arch stabilization. So two rests and two retentive reciprocal arms are prepared on the others are used on the other side. All right. Ring clasp is commonly used. Now you have to know that after the loss of teeth, adjacent teeth drift to fill the space. in most of the cases, you don't find the ideal undercut on the teeth. Now, for example, maxillary teeth, they tend to drift anteriorly and buccally. So the deepest undercut should be located, or usually is located, mesiobuccally, while in the lower arch it goes lingually, so it is located, the deepest undercut is located mesiolingually. So for isolated tilted molars, when they are tilted towards the edentulous space for the maxillary arch and the mandibular arch. Now, for the maxillary arch, you prepare, you use ring clasp. The difference that it has a rest, and the arm goes from the rest on the lingual surface all the way to the other side, and then engages the most or the deepest undercut on the mesiobuccal. Same thing applies on the lower arch. It goes from um, the rest onto the buccal surface, distal surface, and to the deepest undercut mesiolingually. This is called a ring clasp, and again, it's not a complete ring. It has an end in the deepest undercut, and because the arm goes all around along the tooth, it becomes flexible because it's too long. So you can have an additional rest prepared on the tooth to have, يعني it has two rests to strengthen the arm of the clasp. Now, fishhook or hairpin or reverse action clasp, again, if you have the deepest undercut next to the edentulous saddle, you can't use the simple circlet, which is the most commonly used. You have to think of other options. You can use reverse circlet, or you can use fishhook or hairpin or reverse action. The retentive arm goes all along, and it goes back عند the deepest undercut next to the edentulous saddle. Again, if it is a distal extension, it's an option, but the number one option is gingivally approaching clasps, and then you can think of other options. All right. Okay, onlay clasp. This is used to restore the normal occlusion of submerged abutments. And combination clasp. This is commonly used in where you have basically in maxillary canines for more appropriate aesthetics, or when you have severe undercuts. So it's a combination. It has a breast and reciprocal arm made of cobalt chromium or cast, يعني rest and reciprocal arm, but the retentive arm is made of wrought wire. This provides more flexibility, and it is more aesthetically pleasing. So it can be used where you have severe undercuts, or when you have maxillary canines where you want to use as abutments, because the wrought wire can be hidden more easily than the cast clasp. Half and half. This one not commonly used. It has minor connector attached to an occlusal wrist and retentive arm, and another minor connector attached to a reciprocal arm, which is similar to the bar clasp, with or without an auxiliary wrist. This provides double retention. Back action, again, not commonly used. And regarding the gingivally approaching clasps, this is the other major category for clasps. This is an example. This is طبعا هذا الواكس up. This is an I-bar clasp. It approaches the undercut from gingival side, from the gingival side, not from the occlusal side. All right. And this is how it looks like. This is a gingivally approaching clasp. Now it provides a push type of retention. It can be easily inserted, but if you remove it, you have to push it above the survey line, which is much harder if you compare it with the occlusally approaching clasps that can be pulled easily. Push is more difficult than pull. So if the length and the cross section and all the other factors are similar, gingivally approaching clasps are supposed to provide better retention than occlusally approaching clasps. All right. Uh, the parts of gingivally approaching clasps are now all components are similar to those of suprabulge clasps except for the retentive arm, which is composed of an approach arm and a retentive terminal. Now the approach arm is actually minor connector that connects the retentive tip to the denture base. It goes from it crosses طبعا the gingival margin at right angle, and it's the only flexible minor connector because لما نحكي next lecture عن minor connectors رح نعرف انه هم minor connectors كلهم rigid except for the approach arm. The retentive terminal is actually the retentive tip that touches the tooth below the undercut. Now, gingivally approaching clasps, the advantages, they are easy to insert and difficult to remove, so they are supposed to provide better retention. They are more aesthetically pleasing than occlusally approaching clasps, but they tend to collect food debris and they have increased flexibility but reduced bracing and stability because they have less encirclement than the occlusally approaching clasps. Now there are types according to the shape of the retentive terminal: T clasp, modified T, Y, I. This is T. It is shaped like a T. This is used for class 1 and 2 when the retentive undercut is next to the ridge. One of the arms of the T provides retention and the other one improves bracing or reciprocation. Encirclement. Now, modified T clasp is actually half T. This is similar to T, but it lacks the non-retentive arm. It has better aesthetics لأنه it doesn't go anteriorly ما عندها إلا نص T, and it's best for premolars and canines. So T is used when the undercut is actually next to the initial saddle. Y, it's shaped like Y, similar to T but slightly different morphology. And the I class, which is very commonly used, it is used as part of a system called RPI system, especially for distal extension processes. It provides a stress breaking effect. The point is, it touches the tooth at a point only, يعني minimum touch على التooth. Now, if occlusal load is applied, it disengages the tooth, so it does not transfer the harmful forces on the abutment tooth. This is very important for the most distal abutment in distal extension process, especially if it's a premolar. So this is the I clasp, mainly for class 1 and 2 and as part of the RPI system. If the undercut is located mesially, and again it provides stress breaking effect. Now, gingivally approaching clasps are contraindicated in some circumstances. Now, contraindicated if the buccal sulcus is less than 4 millimeters in depth because it will be too short, and too short means less flexible, and also indicated if there is an undercut buccally, soft tissue undercut buccally on the alveolus more than 1 millimeter deep and within 3 millimeters of the gingival margins, because you will be irritating the gingiva because it crosses the gingiva at 90 degrees, and this will be very harmful. So if the undercut is closer to the gingival margin than 3 millimeters and deeper than 1 millimeter, you cannot use gingivally approaching clasps. You have to think of other options. Again, it's perfect. Gingivally approaching clasps are the best options if if retentive cast cobalt chromium clasp is required on a premolar or canine. and part of the RPI system اللي رح نحكي عنه اللي هو easier wrist, distal guiding plane, and eye bar. And if it cannot be used, then road wire occlusally approaching clasp might be used in this case. طبعا حكينا عن كل clasps this way, بس you have to know إنه في إشي اسمه continuous clasp. Continuous clasp is actually a type of major connector. It's a metal bar usually resting on the lingual surfaces of the teeth, and it aids in stabilization and direct retention. And it's actually a major connector. It's not a direct retainer. You have to differentiate between. Now there are several factors that affect your choice of a class. شفتوا في عنا أنواع. And then يعني when you design the partial denture, you have to decide which type of clasps should you be using. The most important factor is the position of the undercut, also health of the periodontal ligament, shape of the sulcus, length of the clasp, appearance, and position of the undercut. Again, the simplest example can على simple circlet that we use if we have the undercut positioned, the deepest undercut or the most favorable undercut is positioned away from the edentulous saddle. It goes from the edentulous saddle towards the other side. While if you cannot use it, if the undercut, the deepest undercut is located next to the saddle, then you have to use other option, ring in this slide for example. كمان بالنسبة للgingival approaching clasps, whether you have to use T, half T or I, depends also on the position of the retentive undercut. Now, health of the periodontal ligament. طبعا for active periodontal disease in general, cobalt chromium partial dentures are not indicated, but there are many cases where the patient had a periodontal disease, but it was controlled, but the patient ended up with reduced periodontal support. Now, if the periodontal support is reduced, occlusally approaching clasps are too rigid, especially if made in cast cobalt chromium. So best thing to use is to use more flexible option, rote wire clasp, أو the less harmful option اللي هو gingival approaching clasps. Alright? And shape of the sulcus, again, if there is attachment that is interfering with the placement of a gingival approaching clasp, or if there is deep undercut, then you have to think of other option. You have to use occlusally approaching, maybe with different material. The length of the clasp, this is very important. Again, occlusally approaching cast cobalt chromium needs at least 15 millimeters to have a certain taper to end with a flexible retentive tip. If it is shorter, it will not be flexible. Then you cannot use it on a premolar, and you cannot use it if the depth of the undercut is more than 0.25 millimeters. Then you either use different material or different design of clasp. The appearance, now you remember that occlusally approaching clasps are, again, all parts of the occlusally approaching clasps are above the survey line except for the retentive tip, while gingival approaching clasps can be hidden more easily. Sometimes you can even hide it, for example, maxillary teeth, على premolars, with canines. You can place it distally, it becomes less visible. While there were sometimes options for tooth-colored clasps, but of course they are not flexible, and they are not appropriate to be used. Occlusion, again, occlusally approaching clasps, they approach the teeth from occlusal parts, so you have to have proper space and clearance, occlusal clearance, to have the clasp not interfering with occlusion. You have to prepare breastfeed, and sometimes you might have to lower the marginal ridge of the tooth to receive the reciprocal and retentive arms. While gingerly approaching clasps, most of the components are below the survey line, and they usually do not interfere. Sometimes the occlusal, the rest, whether it is cingulum or incisal, might interfere. So, but if you have limited space, occlusally approaching clasps are not recommended. indirect retainers آخر إشي رح نحكيه بالمحاضرة اليوم. Now, retention is the resistance to movement away from teeth and tissues. حكينا عن direct retainers and clasps basically, which provide resistance for the prosthesis to move away from teeth. Alright, now if you consider the other scenario, basically in class 1 and 2 prosthesis where you have, or long class 4s, long saddle class 4, there is another possible kind of movement that you have to provide retention against, اللي هي movement where you have dual support. If you have two tissue supported prostheses, there is an option, there is a possibility for the distal extension or the tissue supported part of the prosthesis to move away from tissues. This can be due to forces of gravity, it can be due to sticky food, muscles, whatever. So you have to provide an extra component in the prosthesis. If it is not there already within the design or provided by certain components in the prosthesis, you have to have an extra component added to provide indirect retention. And it is called an indirect retention لأنه it's different from the direct retainers that prevent the movement of the prosthesis away from teeth. This is a part of an RPD that assists the direct retainers in preventing displacement of distal extension bases. So it is actually a thing for distal extension prosthesis. Let's look at these pictures, picture A and picture B. In picture A, it's a lower distal extension prosthesis, whether class 1 or 2, but which is showing only one side, as forces are applied on the distal extensions like sticky food or forces caused by the muscles of mastication. The distal extension أنه ما عندها more distal abutment, it tends to move with the load away from the tissues. If this happens, rotation will occur around the retentive tip of the teeth. This is the fulcrum, and as a distal extension is lifted upwards, the most anterior part sinks downwards. So we have to have a component anterior to the fulcrum that prevents such kind of movement. So in B, we extended a component, we extended a rest on a part of rest on a tooth anterior to the fulcrum, the possible fulcrum line. This rest, now if you imagine forces are applied to left the distal extension away from the tissues, then the fulcrum now is on the provided rest on the premolar. It resists sinking of the anterior part of the prosthesis, the anterior to the fulcrum line. It resists the movement, the sinking of the anterior part of the prosthesis, and thus indirectly resists the movement of the most distal extension away from the tissues. So that's how it works. It indirectly resists the movement of the distal extension away from the tissues by resisting the sinking of the anterior part of the prosthesis, anterior to the fulcrum line, I mean. So that's why it is called indirect retainer, because our shear where it provides indirect retention as opposed to the direct retention provided by the retainers. And also uh, it's a retainer because it provides retention, although it's not a clasp or a precision attachment. It's actually a rest. It's an auxiliary rest اللي حكينا عنها بالlecture الماضية. حكينا إنه في primary rests or primary abutments وفي auxiliary rests that are provided additionally to provide indirect retention. The effectiveness of the indirect retainer is dependent on many factors. It depends on its location from the fulcrum line. The farther from the fulcrum line, the more effective. And the distance from the fulcrum, the location of the distance, the longer the distance, the better the indirect retention. And the rigidity of the connector, effectiveness of the supporting tooth, if premolar and canines are better than incisors. Now, few different types. They can be auxiliary rests or canine rests, canine extension of the occlusal rest, continuous bar and lingual plate, indirect attention from the major connector, from the Rugi support. طبعا best thing to have هلا. This is a class 2 prosthesis where it has a distal extension, and there is طبعا if you imagine the movement of the distal extension away from the tissues, there will be rotation around the fulcrum line on the retentive tips of the most distal abutments, premolar on the distal extension side and on the molar on the other side. Now a rest was extended on the premolar meso-occlusally to provide indirect retention. Now, the farther the rest from the fulcrum, and ideally, if it is perpendicular, if it goes perpendicular on the fulcrum line, this is the most effective. But there are other factors. For example, if here it's an occlusal rest. Occlusal rest provides better support than cingulum rest, and cingulum rest provides better support than incisor rest. So that's why if you have the option, even if it's closer to the fulcrum line, use an occlusal rest better than, because it provides better support and thus it provides better indirect retention than the cingulum or incisal. Although sometimes incisal or cingulum can be farther from the fulcrum line, which means more effective, but it is more effective if it's placed on a premolar, because occlusal rest seat provide better support and indirect retention than cingulum and incisor rest. So you have to weigh out the option. All right, here two cingulum rests on canines. They are called femur arms. Also, you can extend an extension on the extension from the occlusal receipt on the premolar on the canine, but this is very close to the fulcrum, which means it is not that effective as indirect retainer. And sometimes you can get resistance to sinking of the anterior part of the prosthesis, which indirectly prevents movement of the distal extension by means of the major connector. Resting on the anterior rugi, in the rugi area, if you hide the anterior part of the major connector in the rugi area, it resists sinking and thus prevents indirect retention. And this is a kind of major connector, a small lingual plate. Lingual plate rests on the anterior teeth, and there are prepared extra rests on the most distal abutments of the anterior teeth to provide extra indirect retention. It provides resistance to sinking of the anterior part and thus provides indirect retention. Uh, Same thing applies in the maxillary arch. Any component that is actually resting almost horizontally أو على inclined plane anteriorly and anterior to the fulcrum line and resists the sinking of the anterior portion of the processes. It resists the tipping of the distal extension away from the tissues and provides indirect retention. But you have to know that the major connector itself, it cannot be called indirect retainer. It can aid in indirect retention, and that's why, for example, in the lingual plate, if you wanted to provide proper indirect retention, you prepare rest seats and additional rests on the ends of the major connector to provide more appropriate indirect retention, because هو الميجر connector جاي على inclined surfaces does not provide really appropriate indirect retention. It is more favorable if it is horizontal. And these two, they are dental bar major connector and open Kennedy major connector. They also provide indirect retention for the prosthesis. Thank you very much.